started now. This is an awesome turnout. Thank you all for coming. Hope you're enjoying your food. Welcome again to the first of our Sustainability Showcase series. We're still trying to work out a few of the kinks. It's the first one, but we may have some changes down the road, but we're planning on doing things every single week. We have a great lineup of faculty speakers planned for this semester, so stay tuned for some really great updates down the road. Can everyone hear me in the back? I'm trying to project as well as I can. Anyway, my name is Robert Ost. I'm a senior here, and I'm the director of the Council of Sustainable Leaders. I'm one of the people who helped to plan our new showcase series. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our new Chief Sustainability Officer and Director of the Sustainability Institute, Paul Srivastava. We just recently welcomed him on board this summer, and we're excited to see the work that he's going to do with the university in the coming years. So Paul.
Thank you. I have a squeaky voice, so I'm going to set it up a little for the people at the back here. So welcome all of you to this first in a series of talks that are aimed at introducing the work of our faculty to our students and the community. And we are really delighted to see so many of you show up at this very first instance of the series. As you can see, we are still learning how to do these. So not only is Mann our key speaker, he's also our key guinea pig. We're going to test out the audio system, the lighting system in this show, and hopefully improve our performance next time. But I want to begin by thanking the Council of Sustainable Leaders. This is a group of students who conceptualized and have implemented this program. When I arrived here in July, I think within the second week they came to me saying, oh, would you be willing to support a series of lectures? And I thought, yeah, that sounds interesting, we can support it. Next week, Robert comes back with a list of 26 people already committed and lined up for the whole year. So the amount of passion and enthusiasm of the students here has been inspiring. I'm delighted to see the support that the community and faculty and staff have given them, and I look forward to continuing to support this series. So today we are showcasing the work of Mann, a person who does not need any introduction, but Robert Ost and the group asked me to say a few words, so I went to the website and took a look at Michael's resume, his CV, and when I had arrived over here, somebody said, you know, I've never seen a resume of 42 pages. And I looked at Robert's resume, it's 58 pages, single space. I'm going to try to summarize it in 3 sentences. Let me point out 2 or 3 things about it. So all of you know nominally Robert is a university distinguished professor in atmospheric sciences and has joint appointments in the Geosciences Department as well as the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute. And he directs the Earth System Science Center over here. Over his long career, he's received many awards. And I just want to point out a few of them. He was a lead author on observed climate variability and change for an IPCC third synthesis report. He's been a co-author and an author on other IPCC reports, including the one that was cited for the Nobel Prize. He has had a number of awards and honors from NOAA, as NOAA announced him Outstanding Publication Award in 2002, among the selection by Scientific American. He has also been awarded the National Conservation Achievement Award for Science by the National Wildlife Federation. And the interesting thing about Michael's work is that these awards and recognitions are not coming only from his peers in the scientific community. He's one of those rare scientists who has been able to break through the communications barrier and communicate with the public. Bringing science to the public is probably a bigger challenge today than any of the scientific challenges that we study in our lab. We have a lot of knowledge out there in the science community to solve our problems, but the knowledge is not getting to policymakers, to decision makers, to communities in a timely way. So Michael represents a kind of bridge person, and that's why we selected this bridge between two buildings as a venue to embody the kind of work that Michael has been doing. I'm delighted and I'm thankful that you accepted this invitation to come and initiate and open this series of lectures. So without much further talking, I'm going to hand this over to Mike, and I'm sure after it starts there will be time for some questions and answers. And he has to run to another meeting to do bigger communications on the television with WPSU. So we will take a little bit of time towards the end to answer any questions you might have about the Sustainability Institute. Thank you again for coming, and please help me welcome Michael Mann.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm happy to be a guinea pig today. I've been called worse, it's great to be able to kick off this very important series. I want to thank Paul, the Sustainability Institute, the Council of Sustainable Leaders. It's so important that students be active on this front, and I was elated to be able to kick off this series that really embraces the role of the university community, both our faculty and researchers and our students, in hopefully creating a dialogue that will lead to a more sustainable future. I will talk about one very important aspect of a sustainable future, which is climate change, and our ability, hopefully, to do something about climate change. There are no free lunches, as you all know. So despite the free lunch, you're going to have to listen to me for about 30 minutes or so. I'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then hopefully we will have some time for questions before I have to move on. It's going to be hard to see a lot of this. There's a lot of ambient light, and the projector isn't too strong, so just bear with me. Where necessary, I'll try to describe what's going on, even if you can't see it. The first point I want to make is that the science of climate change, the basic science, the greenhouse effect, this isn't rocket science. Although it turns out that rocket science does require an understanding of the greenhouse effect. It turns out that to design a heat-seeking missile, you have to understand the way that the atmosphere actually absorbs heat. If you don't build that into the missile, you won't be able to see the target you're aiming at. So the military in the 1950s literally had to use the greenhouse effect in their rocket science. So we know that the concentrations of these greenhouse gases are rising. The greenhouse effect goes back, our understanding of it goes back to Joseph Fourier in the early 1800s. A scientist who lived so long ago, we don't have a photograph of him. We only have a hand-drawn portrait of him. He understood that certain gases in the atmosphere warm the planet. And over the ensuing 2 centuries, literally, we developed a better and better understanding of the details. But the basics, they go back nearly 2 centuries. The fact that we're increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere through fossil fuel burning, let's do that again, is incontrovertible. This graph is several years old, and it's fundamentally outdated. You have to add another vertical tick mark to the scale now. 390 isn't high enough. We hit 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere for the first time a few years ago. And when I say the first time, we think it's the first time in several million years that atmospheric CO2 has been that high. We are engaged in this unprecedented experiment with the one planet that we have, that we know supports life. And that's the basics. Those are the basics. The greenhouse effect, basic physics, chemistry we've known for nearly 2 centuries. The fact that CO2 is rising at an unprecedented rate, again, irrefutable measurements. What we wouldn't be able to explain as scientists would be if the world were not warming up as a result of that. And the fact that it's warming up isn't the evidence for climate change. It's the validation of everything we understand about this problem. The fact that the observations bear that out. You can't see them, but I will tell you that 2016 was the warmest year on record, beating out 2015, which had been the warmest year on record, beating out 2014, which had been the warmest year on record. Now, that isn't a coincidence. We are seeing a warming of the planet that is right in line with what the models predicted decades ago. What we said we would see if we continued on this course of fossil fuel burning. The impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We see them playing out in the news cycle. Sadly, I would argue we've seen them playing out in a profound way over the past several news cycles this last week. We can see the impacts of climate change on our television screens, in our daily headlines. The impacts are no longer subtle. We are feeling the impacts of climate change now. Whether it's drought, like California. Last year, California had flooding, which took it out of a multi-year drought, which the paleoclimate scientists who study tree rings and other information to reconstruct past patterns of drought, they tell us that was the worst drought that California has seen in at least 1,200 years. The critics will say, oh, so what produced that drought 1,200 years ago then? That wasn't SUVs, that wasn't, no. That's as far back as the records go. We can only say over the past 1,200 years. It's unprecedented as far back as we can go, more than a millennium. That's probably not a coincidence. The models predict that in the subtropical regions in the summer, you will see worse and worse drought. You'll see warmer temperatures, you'll see less rainfall. But for California, it's been feast or famine. The worst drought on record and one of the worst flooding events last winter that took it out of the drought, but instead gave them a whole new set of problems. You can't drive down US Highway 1 right now, the coastal highway. There's a landslide due to the flooding and the heavy rainfall. That's going to take about 6 months for them to clear. So if you're planning on going on seeing Big Sur, you're going to want to wait until next year to do it. And of course, Harvey, the worst flooding event on record. Worst flooding event now on record. Unprecedented storm. I've spent a lot of time over the last week talking about how climate change didn't cause Harvey. We can't say that climate change caused Harvey. What we can say is there are a number of characteristics of the impacts of Harvey that were almost certainly exacerbated by climate change. The most irrefutable of all, about 1/2 foot of sea level rise that's attributable to climate change, a human-caused climate change, meant that that storm surge was 1/2 foot higher than it otherwise would have been. And even 1/2 foot gives you a lot more flooding, a lot more destruction. Sea surface temperatures were at near record levels in that region of the Gulf, several degrees above normal, and normal is often defined as the late 20th century. Well, we had already had nearly a degree of warming by then. So temperatures in that region that have been boosted several degrees in substantial part by climate change, by human-caused warming. That meant that there was more moisture in the atmosphere available to strengthen that storm, stronger storm, a near record rate of intensification, went from a tropical disturbance to a major hurricane in a matter of a couple days. A very rapid intensification, which we can attribute to all that warmth and all that energy that was available to strengthen that storm. Well, all that warmth at the surface of the ocean means through one of the simplest relationships we have. It's basic thermodynamics. And if you question this, then you're questioning the laws of thermodynamics, I say to the contrarians. Warmer temperatures leads to more evaporation. It's actually an exponential relationship. So there was a lot more moisture in the atmosphere because of those very warm surface temperatures. Well, what happens to that moisture when it gets entrained into a storm? It gets turned into rainfall, flooding rainfall. Finally, the way that the system stalled out, it basically stayed in place for a number of days, and that's really a substantial contributor to the extreme nature of the flooding that Houston received. That's really at the very tenuous limit of our scientific understanding, but there is some evidence that climate change and the way the Arctic is warming and the way that's changing the pattern of the jet stream may be slowing down the jet stream in the summer and leading to more of this sort of stalling behavior like we saw. We also saw that with Sandy, Hurricane Sandy in 2012. So the impacts are no longer subtle. We've seen them play out in a tragic way just this past week. Why no action? Now we get to the sort of rhetorical part of the lecture. Well, the reason that we have not yet acted at the level necessary to truly mitigate this existential threat is because there have been powerful interests, fossil fuel interests, and ironically the governor of Texas is beholden to fossil fuel interests. Not coincidentally, he's a climate change denier, so he's literally denying the very thing that is increasing the threat to the people of his state. The Trump administration actually revoked a number of regulations just a week or so before Harvey struck. They revoked a number of regulations that required the government to take into account sea level rise and climate change in coastal development. Also, part of why Houston it saw so much flooding, not only is there global sea level rise, but Houston is subsiding. It's literally sinking. And that's due to oil extraction in large part. So there seems to be a lesson in here. People are listening. So the critics, fossil fuel interests who don't want to see us transition away from fossil fuels, they're pretty happy about us being, as George W. Bush once said, our addiction to fossil fuels. They're obviously profiting from that, and they'd like to see that remain. So they have spent tens of millions of dollars investing in a massive misinformation campaign to deny the threat of climate change, to attack the solution, which is renewable energy, and to poison, literally not only poison the atmosphere, but poison our public discourse when it comes to the issue of climate change. There's a wonderful book by Naomi Oreskes, who's been here a few times, made into a movie, Merchants of Doubt, which is about the modern campaign by fossil fuel interests to deny the reality and threat of climate change, using the same techniques, and guess what, the same people, the same advocates, the same talking heads that they had denying the health impacts of tobacco decades ago are now serving as messengers for the fossil fuel industry in denying the threat of human-caused climate change. Some of the very same individuals. I found myself early on in the crosshairs of this disinformation campaign because of this now iconic graph that my co-authors and I published back in the late 1990s. You can't see it, but if you use some imagination, sort of a Rorschach test, you can't see anything here. Imagine a hockey stick. Not an elephant, but imagine a hockey stick. We reconstructed temperature trends stretching back over the past 1,000 years to place modern warming in a longer-term context. We only have about a century of thermometer measurements, so to have a sense of how unprecedented this warming we've seen over the last century really is, we need to turn to indirect measures, what we call proxy data, to reconstruct the past. And what we found was that the warming spike really has no precedent. As far back as we were able to go, at the time, 1,000 years. You can actually sort of see it there. The current warmth is somewhere up there, well above the end of the curve, as you can see it there. It got named the hockey stick. It became this iconic image in the climate change debate, and because of that, it was fiercely attacked by those looking to discredit the case for concern over climate change. The principle being that if they could just discredit this one iconic graphic, then they could claim to have discredited the entire case for concern about human-caused climate change. In reality, you could get rid of the hockey stick and every other study that has validated it, and we have, as you've already seen, so many fundamental independent lines of evidence that tell us that climate change is real, human-caused, and a problem. It wouldn't matter. But for the cynics, if they can take an icon, be it the hockey stick or Al Gore, and discredit that icon, it's sort of what we call ad hominem. It's a way of sort of shooting the messenger and trying to discredit the scientific case, or trying to discredit the case for concern when you can't discredit the science, because the science is overwhelmingly reaffirmed by the world's entire scientific community. So you go after the individuals who have been trying to communicate the science and the threat that it poses. And I have found myself at the center of those attacks over the years. It's given me an opportunity to play a far more central role in this discussion over what I feel is probably the most important issue that we have ever dealt with as a civilization, and I feel privileged to be able to play that role. So I thank the critics, I thank my attackers for having given me a level of prominence that allows me to try to communicate the threat to the public. There are dozens of studies that have reaffirmed the hockey stick. We now know that the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their last report, based on dozens of studies, said the recent warming is probably unprecedented now in at least 1,300 years. And there are some tentative studies that suggest that the warming spike we're seeing right now is unprecedented in at least tens of thousands of years, as far back as we can go with those lines of evidence. So there is this unprecedented warming taking place. It's not the basis of our understanding of climate change. It's just another line of evidence that tells us that we are impacting our climate in an unprecedented way. Some people will call the attacks on science, the attacks against the hockey stick, against me, the politicization of science. I believe that there is a better term for it. I call it the scientization of politics, something that's even worse. It's the way that science is now used as a political football, and if you don't like the science of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, founded by Republican President Abraham Lincoln, by the way, or the conclusions of every scientific society in the United States and in Europe and around the world that's weighed in on this, all of whom have stated affirmatively that climate change is real, it's human caused, it's already a threat, it will be a far greater threat if we don't act. If you don't like what the world scientists have had to say about this, there's a whole cable network available to you. There is one of the leading newspapers, the Wall Street Journal editorial pages, is a font of climate change denialism. There is a veritable echo chamber in the conservative media that has manufactured this notion that climate change is a hoax. We saw this coming. What we see today in our political discourse since the election of Donald Trump, those of us in the field of climate change saw this coming a decade ago. We knew where we were headed based on the fact-free nature of the attacks that have been made of the science of climate change by conservative special interests and dark money groups and folks like the Koch brothers. So we knew that it was symptomatic of a much deeper problem, and now we're seeing that boil over again. In real time, we're seeing the loss of good faith in our political discourse. The loss of even any semblance of truthfulness when it comes to our policy discussions over some of the most important issues. And I tell my story in the book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, the story of a scientist who didn't really, this isn't what I signed up for when I double majored in applied math and physics at UC Berkeley and went off to Yale University to study theoretical physics. I didn't think that I was on a career trajectory that would place me at the center of the most contentious societal debate, perhaps in human history. But as I said before, having found myself there, through this circuitous route that I couldn't possibly have tried to navigate. Having found myself in that position, I've embraced the opportunity that that's given me to inform this very important discussion. So the attacks on climate change, again, the conservative media Climategate. This might sound familiar. A very important political debate, very important political event. Special interests are trying to game the result of that political event. Russia, involvement by Russia and WikiLeaks. The theft of emails to attack the messenger, to discredit the messenger. What do people think I'm talking about? The presidential election? No, I'm talking about Climategate. Again, we saw this years ago. This Climategate was the test ground for what we saw deployed in the latest presidential election, where fossil fuel interests, the conservative media, promoting the theft of emails, and WikiLeaks and Russia playing a part in distributing these stolen emails from scientists, including myself, where out of context snippets were used to try to attack the science, to try to discredit the science. And this pretty much spread through the conservative media with a matter of days. It was intended to sabotage the December 2009 Copenhagen summit, which was seen as the greatest opportunity for climate progress at that time, international progress. And the days leading up to that, we saw these emails distributed. It turns out they had had them for months, but they distributed them right before Copenhagen. And Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian delegate, showed up at Copenhagen and said, these stolen emails reveal that climate change is an overblown problem and is going to fundamentally influence the proceedings from our standpoint. So it was used very effectively by those looking to forestall policy action. I won't talk about. All right, well, Sarah Palin at the time wrote this op-ed in the Washington Post where she said that these emails revealed that leading experts were destroying records, manipulated data. I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post 9 days later where I pointed out that nothing she had said was factually correct. And even Sarah Palin herself finally accepted that, because these are her own words. A lot of those emails obviously weren't meant for public consumption. That's Sarah Palin. And they could be misinterpreted if taken out of context. Of course, she was talking about her own emails that had been released in response to a Freedom of Information Act request from her time as governor of Alaska. And the attacks continued. James Inhofe, who has declared climate change to be the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people, and thinks that a snowball carried out to the Senate floor is evidence against human-caused climate change, sometimes referred to affectionately as Senator Snowball. Pure coincidence. He is one of the largest recipients of fossil fuel money in the US Senate. He wanted to criminalize, he wanted to actually prosecute scientists for the discredited allegations that came out of these stolen emails. There have now been, I think, 10 different investigations in the US, the UK. They've all found that there was no impropriety on the part of the scientists. The only wrongdoing was the criminal theft of the emails. But that took several years, and in the meantime, climate change deniers were able to exploit the misinformation for maximum effect. Ken Cuccinelli, Attorney General of Virginia, wanted to subpoena all of my personal emails after this Climategate event. When he came in as Attorney General of Virginia, Tea Party Republican, wanted to use a civil investigative demand, a civil subpoena available to the Attorney General, which was designed to ferret out Medicare fraud. But since he claimed that climate change is a hoax, is a fraud, he argued that this was a perfectly appropriate vehicle to demand all of my personal emails so they could go through them and try to find something that would prove that climate change was just invented by me or Al Gore or China, if you believe the president. Well, scientists, groups of scientists, the AAUP, lots of different public policy organizations, even the conservative group FIRE, came out and blasted what they saw as an obvious attempt to intimidate scientists and academics whose findings might not comport with the funders of certain politicians like Ken Cuccinelli, who got much of his campaign money from fossil fuel interests. The Washington Post published no less than 5 editorials blasting what they described as Ken Cuccinelli's witch hunt. Their Pulitzer Prize winning editorial cartoonist Tom Tolles ridiculed Cuccinelli's witch hunt not once but twice. I've since written a book with him, The Madhouse Effect, which came out this fall before the election, but which feels far more prescient now, given what has played out since the election. In the meantime, Cuccinelli's subpoena had been quashed by the court on a technicality. In his 40-page filing to the court, he had failed to provide evidence of wrongdoing on my part. So they threw it out. He challenged it to the state Supreme Court, which ruled against it with prejudice, meaning they never want to see an attorney general come back to the court with something like this again. So that battle was won. Cuccinelli ran in the next gubernatorial election for governor of Virginia. As you can see in this picture, I actively campaigned with his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, who was victorious. Cuccinelli, in defeat, ended up helping run an oyster farm on Tangier Island, which is an island in the Chesapeake Bay that is succumbing to the effects of global sea level rise. I promise I'm not making this up. You can look it up. You can't make this stuff up. Governor McAuliffe was one of the first governors, and I have environmentalist friends who were critical of McAuliffe, said he was too much of a centrist, too friendly to natural gas. When Trump pulled out of Paris, one of the first governors to say, we don't care what Trump does, we are committed to the Paris Agreement. Terry McAuliffe was one of the first few governors to weigh in. I thanked him personally for it. As Terry has said to me, elections matter. And clearly they do. So, what else can we say? The assault, as you know, hasn't stopped. Even before the election, Lamar Smith, the chair of the House Science Committee, who's a climate change denier. In fact, Republicans on the House Science Committee both deny climate change and they deny the theory of evolution. They're equal opportunity science deniers. And this is the House Science Committee. They're responsible for our policy when it comes to matters of policy relevant science. And they're headed up by a climate change denier who has subpoenaed scientists, climate scientists at NOAA. He's tried to cut funding at the NSF and NOAA and NASA for climate science. He has tried to engage in criminal investigations of climate scientists to intimidate them. All in a day's work. And that was before the election. Democrats spoke out against these actions. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times at the time, blasting this assault on climate science. But I had none of us had any idea what was coming. There was an assault on climate science underway well before last year's election. But with Donald Trump, what we've seen is an escalation of climate change denialism to a level we've never seen before. We have never had a climate change denying president before. We've had some presidents who were skeptical about certain policies, and there's a worthy political debate to be had about what we do to solve this problem. I would note that some of the great environmental policy successes in the past have come under Republican administrations. Interestingly enough, Richard Nixon founded the EPA. The Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act happened under his watch. Ronald Reagan signed the Montreal Protocol to ban ozone-depleting chlorofluorocarbons. George H.W. Bush acted on acid rain. He introduced something called cap and trade to deal with the acid rain problem. That was a Republican solution. But what we've seen now is a rejection of sort of this moderate pro-environmental wing of the Republican Party by this president who now obviously represents the most extreme views about environmental sustainability and has literally put in place a dream team, a climate change denial dream team running his administration. EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt is most known as Attorney General of Oklahoma for suing the EPA, ghostwriting policy documents for fossil fuel interests, and receiving lots of money from the Koch brothers, the largest sort of privately held fossil fuel interest and major funders of climate change denialism. Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, former CEO of ExxonMobil, the world's most powerful fossil fuel interest that spent tens of millions of dollars trying to, on a PR campaign to deny the reality and threat of climate change, even as its own internal research documents from its own scientists in the 1970s used the word catastrophic to describe the potential impacts of ongoing burning of fossil fuels. So Rex Tillerson, their former CEO, is now our Secretary of State in charge of our foreign policy. What could go wrong there? Rick Perry, who would get rid of the Department of Energy that he heads if he could remember its name, another climate change denier. Ryan Zinke, Department of Commerce, Department of Interior, sorry, climate change denier. So what can we do? And one of the things I was asked to talk about, sort of some of my own efforts at outreach communication to sort of break through the morass in our public discourse on this issue. And so I will talk a bit about what I've been doing. You know, we've seen that despite the political winds that we face when it comes to issues of environmental sustainability, the headwind rather than what was formerly a tailwind that we face when dealing with issues of environmental sustainability. It can be very depressing, dispiriting, the challenges that we're now up against. But we've been served a very important reminder recently that the voice of the people still matters. We saw that in the Affordable Care Act debate, the Obamacare debate, that the voice of the people, it turns out, still matters. When people mobilize, it can still make a difference. It can still levy enough pressure on our politicians to, at times, overcome the extreme pressure being put on them by fossil fuel lobbyists and others who are trying to game the system. So we have to speak out. We have to use our voice. I was at a Senate hearing last March, chaired by Lamar Smith of Texas. There were 3 climate change deniers or contrarians invited by the Republicans, and then there was 1 individual invited by the Democrats. That was me. So it was 3 on 1. And I feel, you know, I think that was unfair. I think it was unfair. They would have needed at least 20 to have any chance making a convincing case for the garbage that they were putting forward. And I think truth sort of won out on that day. And I think climate change deniers looked rather small and silly. And so I do think we have to call out denialism where we see it, because those untruths that are allowed to persist are often accepted as truth. So we have to challenge that. Not that we're going to change the views of some of these hardcore climate change deniers. Let's not be foolish into thinking. Those of us who have encountered climate change denialism in our daily lives know that often it's so embedded in ideological sort of tribal identity politics that it's extremely difficult to change those views with facts and data and logic, because it's not about any of that. But denialism is poisoning our larger discourse to the point where many, honest, confused folks in the middle don't know what to make of it. They have been sort of led into thinking that there really is a scientific debate because of all this noise and because of the very effective campaign of denialism that has been fought by fossil fuel interests and their abettors. So it is important to take that on. There was a March on Science that I spoke at in April on Earth Day. I was at the front of the march with my friend Bill Nye, and we garnered some good media attention for sort of the notion that science has to stand up. Science, whether it likes it or not, is under attack. We have to recognize that. We can no longer pretend that we can just stay in our labs and if we just ignore it, it'll go away. The battle has come to us, and we need to engage. It doesn't mean everybody has to be out on the street protesting, but it means that we have to do what we can to try to return our public discourse to a fact-driven, good faith discourse. Lots of interviews, many of them from State College, Pennsylvania, you'll see up at the top there. I do lots of speaking engagements and lectures around the country. I expend some carbon in doing that. I like to think that I'm making up for it in the outreach that I'm doing. And working with opinion leaders, Leonardo DiCaprio, my friend Bill Nye, recently Sir Richard Branson, doing an event with him. These people have the ability to really change the dialogue. And some people say, well, why are you, we shouldn't debase ourselves by, hanging out with these hypocritical celebrities who jet around. Many of these folks could be living the jet set lifestyle, but instead they're spending a lot of their time and effort trying to raise awareness about this issue because they care about it. And they have an opportunity to change the dialogue in a way that none of us does. They have a voice that is orders of magnitude greater in our public discourse than we do. And if we can work with them, and if we can help arm them with information and tools, then I say that's win-win. And so I'm more than happy to do that. Working with politicians, again, people say you've become political. Well, politics came to me. I didn't come to politics. It came to me. But ultimately, now we do face a battle where there are politicians who want to discredit our science and want to undermine efforts to move to renewable energy to solve this problem. And there are other politicians who may not be perfect, but they are proactive in their policies and their efforts to raise awareness about climate change and to try to accomplish something. And we have to help out those politicians. I don't care if they're Democrats or Republicans. A good friend of mine, his name's Bob Inglis. He was a former congressman from South Carolina in one of the reddest districts of South Carolina. Conservative, evangelical Christian, conservative Republican, had I think a 97% perfect lifetime conservative voting record. But he made the mistake of speaking out about climate change, which he views as a matter of our stewardship to the earth and our obligation to future generations to not degrade this wonderful planet, creation in his terms. And so he spoke out about the issue of climate change and then found himself at the receiving end of a primary challenge funded by the Koch brothers to get him out of his congressional seat. And he lost that next election. He had won, I think, with about 70% of the vote. Originally, he lost with only 20-something% of the vote. It's amazing what tens of millions of dollars concentrated into one media environment can do. So now Bob Inglis, good friend of mine, travels around the country advocating for conservative solutions to the climate change problem and trying to win over conservatives back to the side of science and welcome them back to the legitimate debate that exists about policy solutions to the problem, and encouraging them to get away from the anti-science that has poisoned the party. And so, there are heroes on both sides. In my own story, when Joe Barton, the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee back in 2005, just after I'd come to Penn State, came after me, was threatening a subpoena, demanding, again, all my emails, all of my computer programs in an effort to discredit me before a very important vote on an energy bill in Congress. Joe Barton, again, total coincidence that he was one of the few largest recipients of fossil fuel money in the U.S. House of Representatives, engaged in this campaign to intimidate me and my co-authors. And a number of prominent Democrats came out to defend us, but our fiercest defenders were two Republicans. Sherwood Boehlert, who was the chair of the House Science Committee at the time, an old school pro-science, pro-environment Republican who's become a dear friend of mine, and another Republican, a name you may recognize, John McCain, wrote an op-ed in the Chronicle of Higher Education, stopping just short of calling out his fellow Republican, Joe Barton, of engaging in modern-day McCarthyism, using far harsher words than any of the other politicians who had challenged. And so it's a reminder that these issues were not always divided along partisan political lines, and there are a number of good Republicans today who are working hard to pull back their party from this cliff of denialism and delay that they've been engaged in. The irony of the era of Trump is that in a weird way it might actually be an opportunity. It might be an opportunity for the more moderate voices in the Republican Party to say, don't go off the cliff with Donald Trump. Come back to where this party was. Let's return to our founding principles and what we stood for. And I am hopeful that there may be a possibility for a return to a more sane and better faith public discourse over issues like climate change. I could go on, but I know we're running out of time, so I will just leave it there. Thank you very much. So we got time for some questions?
Before we get started with questions, I just want to make one quick reminder. All your food stuff is compostable, so the packaging and the silverware and everything, you can throw that in compost bins. We have recycling, composting behind this wall here and then kind of up and around the area. So make sure to throw your stuff in the compost receptacle when you get the opportunity. Now we'll open the floor for questions. We'll have a few minutes for that. And
can you comment on possibility of geoengineering solutions for climate change?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Sorry, I just swallowed water down the wrong hole. Geoengineering. So there are some like Rex Tillerson, our current Secretary of State, former CEO of ExxonMobil, is not strictly speaking a climate change denier. He has come along, his predecessor, Lee Raymond, former CEO before him, was a climate change denier. Rex Tillerson says that climate change is real, but it's not that big a problem. And by the way, the solution is geoengineering. Rather than curtail our burning of fossil fuels, why don't we engage in some other planetary scale, unprecedented intervention with the Earth system? Shoot particles up into the stratosphere to reflect away sunlight, dump iron into the oceans to try to fertilize algae, and the list goes on, and much of this stuff is the stuff almost of science fiction, but it's very real. The proposals are very real. There are scientists who are promoting them. There are scientists in my field who are profiting, who have made for-profit corporations, have started up for-profit corporations to engage in some of these schemes. Our chapter on geoengineering in the Madhouse Effect is entitled Geoengineering, or What Could Possibly Go Wrong? And I guess that would be my response, is that the principle of unintended consequences reigns supreme when we start talking about many of these planetary interventions. When you start looking at them in more detail, what you realize is all sorts of unintended things could happen, in part because if you shoot particles into the stratosphere and block out some of the sunlight, those sulfate particles, they would be, what we call aerosols, can actually interact with the atmosphere to worsen acid rain. They can also increase ozone depletion in the stratosphere. This would potentially dry out the continents by changing the large-scale circulation of the atmosphere, and the regions that would cool from the geoengineering would be different from the regions that warm most from global warming. So you would end up with some regions that warm even faster and some regions that might cool. And the bottom line is that we can't even predict some of the potential consequences of engaging in these planetary manipulations. And so there is one relatively safe form of geoengineering in my view, which is carbon sequestration. It's basically, when I was in Bill Maher a couple years ago, he talked about a giant, sucking machine to suck up the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I said, doesn't Dyson make that? But basically that's what we're talking about. We can suck the CO2 back out of the atmosphere using some fairly elaborate and expensive technology, and maybe it would get cheaper if we were to deploy it and scale it up through economies of scale. But you're trying to get the genie back into the bottle, basically, and you're fighting the laws of thermodynamics as well as the laws of economics. It would be expensive to do. Some would argue maybe we might need a stopgap solution if we just go too far. This would be a way to draw CO2 back down out of the atmosphere. It wouldn't suffer. There's no obvious means by which it would lead to some of these other unintended consequences that we might get with other geoengineering schemes. It should be relatively safe, but it would be expensive to do, potentially as much as $1,000 per ton of carbon. Now here's the thing, the damage done by the emission of a ton of carbon eventually could become greater than that. And so under those circumstances, it might actually be cost effective to start doing this. But there's the danger that when we start putting these things out there, it becomes a crutch for those who don't want to engage in the more difficult, potentially, but necessary work of, stemming the problem at its source, which is our burning of carbon, our burning of fossil fuels. Thanks for the question. Question over here, yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much. And I wonder what you would say to students who want to get involved, as well as become more media literate about climate denial.
Thanks. Great question. All sorts of things. There are groups on campus. There's a graduate student group, Science Policy Society. There are the sustainability undergraduates who help sponsor this event. There are lots of organizations on campus that students can get involved in, and those organizations are tapped into sort of a larger infrastructure of policy solutions and access to information. So I think that's a great place to start. But there's so many other things that you can do. If you want to arm yourself with information, so when you go back for Thanksgiving, when kids go back home, and sometimes there's that Uncle Charlie who shows up for Thanksgiving. We all know Uncle Charlie, watches certain television news networks, gets his information from certain websites, and is absolutely convinced that climate change is a hoax. And he comes armed with a whole bunch of talking points. Well, there's a great app. There's a website called skepticalscience.com, and you can download this thing as an app on your smartphone, and it has the list of 100 whatever leading climate change denier talking points with the actual response of what the science has to say at the beginner, intermediate, and advanced level. So you could say, Uncle Charlie, that's actually number 3 on the list, and with you, I'm going to start at the introductory level. Thanks. Question here, yeah.
So
and then in back, yeah.
Doing a really good job on presenting and analyzing climate change. Do you think there's a lack of consideration or lack of focus on social science, public policy, international relations, foreign policy, in their study on the effect of climate change and how to solve it? Because I think social science is the solution for climate change.
Yeah, I mean, there is sometimes a bunker mentality that we find in academia, that individual disciplines are sort of isolated from each other. And here at Penn State, I think we're doing a pretty good job at crossing those interdisciplinary boundaries and having communication between the scientists and the social scientists and the humanities, which is very important because fundamentally, a lot of this, more than anything else, is a matter of ethics. The ethics of what we're doing to the planet, what we're leaving behind for other generations, social inequities of the changes that are happening. Just look at Houston and New Orleans, and there's a climate justice issue here as well. The people who suffer the most are the ones who have the least means to cope with it, had the least role often in creating the problem in the first place. So each of these disciplines has a very important voice in this discussion, and at Penn State there has been an effort to bring these different disciplines together, but we're still working to do that even more, and academia is the ideal place for that to happen, and so I'm pretty bullish on Penn State's efforts to solve this disciplinary boundary problem and really getting all the different colleges and schools working together to talk about and tackle these problems in a holistic way. And I think this series here is part of that effort. So I'm pretty optimistic that we're doing that here at Penn State, and I think we're doing a better job in general at universities around the country. There was a question back here, and then, yeah. Do you still have your question? You? Yeah.
Sure. This kind of came on a couple of other questions. For those of us who are educators, what do you think, you mentioned when you were coming up through the ranks that you were studying physics, you didn't think you would land these kinds of situations. So what new skills do we need to be equipping undergraduate students in particular with in the environmental sciences to navigate this new world?
Great question. I teach a first-year seminar, EMSC 100S in Earth and Mineral Sciences. Our first-year seminar is actually three credits, so it's a regular course that students take. And I don't really do any math or physics. Mine is about climate change, and I talk about a lot of things that we've been talking about here. And one of the, if nothing else, one of the things that I hope my students will come away with, and I really try to, try very hard to instill in them, essentially the importance of critical thinking and critically evaluating sources. Because in today's world, it's so easy to go online. Well, we saw how fake news, literally fake news, sort of poisoned our most recent election. And it's so easy for people to become victims of misleading content, fake news, etc. And so, now in the world, of the internet, where it's so deceptively easy to get information, quote unquote information, and answers to questions, it's become so much more important to evaluate the sources. I grew up, and I think many of us in this room grew up at a time when there were 3 major news networks. Most of us got our information from these 3 networks. There was a principle that you were entitled, as Daniel P. Moynihan Center from New York once said, entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And we all operated basically with the same set of facts, and we could differ in our opinions. When Walter Cronkite ended his newscast with, and that's the way it was on September 1st, 2017, we all accepted that that's the way it was, and we could differ amongst ourselves. Today, we're no longer operating on that sort of neutral playing field, but instead, so too many people are victims of misleading news, fake news, misleading information. So teaching our students, as soon as they come in, their first semester at Penn State, and just sort of driving it in, the importance of when you find a news article, evaluate, is this a real news organization? Who are they? Who wrote this? Do they have any ties? Does this website have any potential conflicts of interest? Does it have any ties to outside organizations? The internet is also really good about tracking those things down too. There's nothing to stop people from doing that. And so to me, more than anything else with these students, it's about that. It's about critical thinking skills early on, getting them to understand the incredible importance of evaluating the reliability of sources and understanding what it means to be a trusted source versus a not so trusted source.